All right, today we're studying Psalm number 78, and this is the book. Whoops. And this is a massive psalm. It has 72 verses. So I'm just going to hit a few highlights as fast as possible. So the overview is that this psalm recounts all the miracles that God wrought for Israel from the exodus of Egypt to David's becoming king over Israel. In verse 2, it says, I will open my mouth with a parable. I will utter riddles to describe the events of long ago. So this is one of the issues with scripture, is that sometimes it uses cryptic language or metaphors or riddles, allegorical speech. And when it's translated, it's sometimes misunderstood and taken literally, but it's figurative speech. And so this could be sometimes problematic because, for example, when somebody is described as having rays of light emanating from them, and it's mistranslated instead of rays of light as horns, obviously it causes misunderstanding of the intention of the verse. In verse 4, it says, we will not withhold from their children. So what this is pertaining to is our brothers and sisters who do not study scripture and are not aware of the traditions outlined in the Bible and so forth. It's our obligation to remind them and not to withhold it from them. So it's our obligation and responsibility to share what we know with others and to not allow them to remain ignorant. Verse 10, so it's talking about the humility of Ezekiel, and the verse says, they did not keep the covenant of God and refused to follow God's Bible. So even after witnessing the fate of the Ephraimites who relied upon their strength instead of God, the wayward generation did not learn a lesson. And this is a recurring theme that over and over again, God shows Israel and the world that they should rely upon him and not try to take matters into their own hands, because anything that's successful, it's only because it's God's will and it's not man's doing alone. The Ephraimites, that story pertains to that they tried to wage a battle on their own, and it was not successful. And they ended up, a lot of them died, and then they retreated. In verse 28, it says, and he dropped them inside his camp around his dwellings. And what this is pertaining to is that God brought meat close to the Israelites so that they would not have the burden of retrieving it from far. So this is during their sojourn for 40 years in the desert. They had manna, which was the food that fell from the heavens. And the miracle about the manna was it tasted like anything that they wanted. So if they craved meat, it would taste like meat. If they wanted bread, it would taste like bread. But this wasn't enough for them because they wanted to see what were the limits of God, because other nations in the world, such as the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the pagans, they all had many, many gods. There's the god of the ocean, the god of the earth, the god of this, the god of that, and each one had their own limitations. So likewise, they thought that God was also somehow limited, and they wanted to test God and to find out what were God's limitations. So they asked for meat. The manna was not sufficient, and so they got meat. And it says, for the righteous, the birds fell right at their doorstep. For the average people, they fell further away, but within the camp. However, the wicked had to retrieve it from outside the camp. Thus, God rained meat upon them like dust. This refers to the righteous, for whom it came down upon them right at their doorstep. And he dropped them inside his camp for the average people around his dwellings. For the wicked, it was far away. So unfortunately, this situation that no matter what God did, the Israelites always tested God and doubted God. And for that reason, that generation didn't make it to the promised land because they didn't have the faith in God. They actually all died in their desert, and only their children made it into the promised land. It was also obviously because of the sin of the golden calf. But verse 52, it talks about God drove his nation like sheep and guided them like a flock in the desert. So it's pertaining to David, who was a shepherd as well. Let me see. There's many verses about this, and let's see. Okay, so verse 71 as well. God chose the leaders of Israel by observing how they provided for the sheep in their care. David would first bring the young out to eat the soft grass. Then he would bring the older sheep to graze on the semi-soft grass. And finally, he would bring the strong sheep to graze on the tough grass. Upon seeing this behavior, God said, "One who knows the particular needs of each individual and tends to them accordingly is surely fit to lead my people." And many of the leaders of Israel were also shepherds, including Moses as well. This is the meaning of the present verse. For his place following the nursing ewes, he brought him to shepherd his nation Jacob, Israel, his inheritance. So it says also furthermore that David is the archetypal leader of the Jewish people, and he was first a shepherd. No creature was too small for his care and attention. The tender love displayed by David ultimately earned him the kingship. The message to any aspiring leader is simple. The hallmark of the Jewish leader is to care for the individual, beginning with a dedication to the youth. So King David, actually, it was prophesied that one of his father's sons would be the king. And the prophet went to each of David's brothers. I think he had like 9 or 10 brothers, and he went one by one, and he said, this one is not it, this one is not it, this one is not it. And David's father didn't even think that David was on like the caliber of being king, because he was just a lowly, simple shepherd. But when the prophet saw King David, he knew that he was the one that was destined to be the king and not his brothers. So again, we see over and over again the importance of the attribute of humility. It's not people who are full of themselves, who even like dress in nice clothes and things like that, that are not necessarily king material. And verse 72, and he tended them with the integrity of his heart and led them with the skill of his hands. So this is at the end of the Psalms, and it's talking about the way that David was virtuous, and it tells us to learn from history and not rebel against God as the Israelites did in the desert, to follow the ways of David, who merited kingship because of the integrity of his ways. Just a couple other things that I wanted to share from verse 53. It's talking about how the Egyptians were drowned in the Sea of Reeds, and it's the whole metaphor of the ocean. So the waters of the sea are a metaphor for divine awareness, as in the verse, "The world will be filled with the knowledge of God as the waters cover the sea." And that comes from Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 14. To drown the opposition means to neutralize it by suppression. It means that when we feel its creeping ascendancy, we smother it and banish it from our awareness. But when we say that the enemy is covered and immersed in the sea, it means that the enemy has been transformed, its godly core revealed. Instead of the enemy, it is now an ally. In our personal lives, when the animal soul confronts us with its shallow drives, our instinct might be to yell at it and chase it away. But the ultimate goal is not to drown the animal soul, but to bring it along in our spiritual progress, to transform it so that it too wishes to serve God. Likewise, in the world at large, A time will come when the nations that oppose godliness will not be drowned like the Egyptians of old, but will be covered by the sea of divine awareness. They will be transformed into forces for good. David, who compiled the Psalms, is the progenitor of the Messiah. It is therefore he who alludes to the true transformation, the covering of evil, which will take place in the times of the Messiah, when the world will be filled with the knowledge of God as the waters cover the sea. I thought that was really beautiful. And okay, one more concept that I want to share before we wrap it up. And it's coming from verse 60 and verse 61 and 69, and then we're done. Okay, so verse 60, and he abandoned the tabernacle of Shiloh, the tent where he had dwelt among people. One might wonder, should God's tabernacle be destroyed because of fools? The fools are pertaining to people who kept questioning God and testing God. If God was disgusted with Israel, why would that result in the destruction of his tabernacle? The answer is that God took out his wrath on the tabernacle, the Mishkan, instead of destroying Israel or the Israelites, the people. Thus, he abandoned the tabernacle at Shiloh, for as the verse concludes, its entire purpose was to be a place for God to dwell among people. Therefore, he preferred that the tabernacle be destroyed instead of his people. So God does not seek a home in a temple or a tent, but rather in people who are a sanctuary for God, as it is written, and this comes from Exodus chapter 25, verse 8. They shall make for me a sanctuary, and I will dwell within them. The verse does not say, I will dwell within it, the sanctuary, but within them, the people. For God does not make his home in a tent or a tabernacle, but in people, if they are worthy and whole. But if the people transgress God's will, he will abandon his holy sanctuary, since his interest is not in the structure, but in the people. Thus, God abandoned the tabernacle at Shiloh because his intention in the first place was that it be a tent to dwell among people, not within wood and stones. All right, so from verse 61, okay, let's see, where do we start? So this is talking about the abduction of the ark, and this is interesting historical information here. So in the days of Eli the high priest, Israel was attacked by the Philistines. In the first battle, the Israelites whose hearts had turned from God were driven back after losing 4,000 men. The elders of Israel remembered that in the days of Joshua, the holy ark, which contained the tablets, would be carried at the head of the army, and that always ensured victory. So they went to the tabernacle at Shiloh and demanded that the ark be given to them to take to war. And this was not seen as a good thing because it was not a wholehearted return to God, but rather an attempt to exploit the ark and use it as a talisman. So it's not always what you do, but your intentions behind why you're doing what you're doing that's important. Hophni and Pinchas, Eli's two sons, who had introduced corruption into the tabernacle service, and that's why the Mishkan and the temples were destroyed, because the priests, the Kohanim, had become corrupted, and so it was already degraded, and so that's why the temples were destroyed. So they accompanied the ark to battle, but it was God's will that the Philistines should triumph and that Israel were routed again. This time, 30,000 Israelite soldiers were slain, and the rest fled in confusion. Hophni and Pinchas were among the dead, and the ark was taken by the Philistines. For the first time, the holy ark, which epitomized God's strength and presence, was in the hands of a pagan enemy. It remained there for 7 months, during which time the Philistines suffered various calamities. Eventually, they sent it back to Israel. And so now some people are under the impression that the ark with the tablets is being held at the Vatican. All right, last but not least, verse 69. And he built his sanctuary as permanent as the heavens, like the earth. He established it forever. So until that point, the sanctuary had no permanent place, neither in Gilgal, Shiloh, Nob, nor Gibeon, the places where it had been stationed temporarily. In contrast, God established Mount Zion as its place forever. When the Jews sinned, the temple was destroyed, but it will return there when the Jews return to God. So the important thing here is humility, trust, and faith in God, and returning to God, because that is what is going to bring everlasting peace to the world. Thank you for watching. God bless you and have a great day. Bye-bye.